Lance, who's going to speak next, he's going to really kind of follow up to what RJ said and show, I'm guessing, you're going to kind of talk about how to monitor some of these bugs, these microbial populations, how to monitor them, how some of the testing may look, why you should consider maybe some of this testing, and kind of get into it. So RJ set the foundation, and Lance is going to talk about testing more, and then we'll have Russell, who kind of puts it all together on his farm for us. So it's a nice little round package for you guys. So everybody come back in, find your seats, and let's let Lance get started. We're behind schedule a little bit, so this cuts into your lunchtime, but that's okay. Let's give Lance a round of applause.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, I'm actually going to do this old school. I'm going to stand at the podium if I can get this in here. All right. Everybody hear me all right? Okay, good. You want me to turn the microphone on? I talk loud. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I know that this is kind of like drinking through a fire hose sometimes. Just for the record, that was RJ's 101 version, because when RJ calls me and asks me questions, I just shrug my shoulders and go, where do you come up with this stuff? But brilliant man. I've known RJ for years, probably pushing 7, 8, 9 years now. Just a phenomenal guy with this, and I'm glad that he kind of kicked this thing off. I want to thank also Colleen and the team here, the Conservation District, everybody around setting this up. This is great. Don't normally get 3 screens. You'd be surprised. Russell and I have ended up at people's farms and their barns. We've just doing this with literally a computer screen, so it's kind of nice. That's why I'm going to stand at a podium. I feel important. I'm not, but I feel important. But anyway, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what we do. So I worked in a commercial soil testing laboratory for about 17 years. 10 years ago, while I was working at that other laboratory, I started the first commercial scale soil health testing division in the country. My background, let me start by saying this: I am not a soil scientist. I'm not an agronomist. My background is in biology and chemistry. Then I did a master's in microbiology and did a PhD in soil microbial ecology. And I'm also not a farmer. And here I am talking to farmers and running a soils lab. Imagine that. But what really drew me to this landscape was I was going to do marine biology for years, and I wanted lab experience. Now, when you grow up in central Nebraska, do you have any idea how far away you are from an ocean? I used to get a hard time for that all the time. But when I realized after years of looking there are no sharks in the Platte River, I decided I wanted some real-world experience. So I started working in a lab just to kind of understand the ins and outs and do some of that work. And I fell in love with the agricultural community. More importantly, the individuals that were actually struggling and trying to do something different, regardless of your motivation, whether it's to preserve the farm for your kids or your grandkids, fix the climate, feed the world, just put $1 in your pocket. I didn't care. I really fell in love with the stories and the community aspect of that. And so here I am. So today I'm going to go through a little bit about what we do at Regen Ag Lab. So in 2019, I stepped out, decided I was going to go start a laboratory. Kind of decided I was tired of steering the ship. I wanted to actually own the ship. And for anybody who's got that fiery independence underneath of them, they understand exactly what I'm talking about. So I always start off with this. I get to stand up here and my name gets plastered all over the place, and people usually call and want to talk to me, and that's fine. But I'm not the one who runs the lab. I have nothing to do with the results that you get. These are the people that do the work. Without them, Regen Ag Lab doesn't exist, and I'm not standing here. So if you've got people that are working with you, you can all share your stories, your husbands, your wives, your kids, your neighbors. These are the people that help you do this type of work. And it's important to understand that, recognize it, and leverage it. I certainly do. My leverage is that I pay people, right? If I don't pay them, they aren't working. But I pay them because that allows me to do what I love to do. I've got an analytical chemistry degree. I don't like being an analytical chemist. It's not for me. Got the degree. That doesn't mean much. But I like doing this part. So it's these people here. Yes, my kids run around the lab. You can see how happy my son is. He had to stop working. He's running your conventional extracts because they're simple enough. He can do them at 3. All right, I'm not poking that much fun. But anyway, it's these people. Now, we have a couple others that aren't pictured here. We just hired in. And also Dr. Rick Haney is an employee of Region Ag Lab. So you'll hear me talk about the Haney Test. Yes, that is the same person. So we'll talk about that and what we're doing with that here in a minute. But I'm just going to jump in, and I've got a couple of tests I'm just going to briefly overview, and then we'll dive in a little deeper on the Haney Test. But one of the tests that we launched here a couple of years ago is called the cover crop test. Now, is anybody in here growing cover crops? Please let there be more than one hand. Okay, great. So you probably ask yourself this question, or at least ask somebody this question, because I get it all the time. Well, what's the nutrient credit from this cover crop? How much nitrogen am I going to get out of this cover crop? When am I going to get it, right? And it's the same questions we always ask. It's like, well, I'm going to put on 5 tons of manure. How much nitrogen's available the first year, et cetera, right? And usually, and I don't have a problem picking on extension agents, so I apologize. But usually you ask that question and somebody licks their thumb and sticks it out the window and goes, about 35%. 35% of what? Of whatever you put out there. Okay, great. It's not quite that simple, but there's a lot of that happens, right? And a lot of times with cover crops, this is what I would hear from producers. Drive down the road, roll the window down, look out and go, that looks like a pretty good stand. How tall is it? Window wheel tall? I don't know, I didn't get out of the truck. Okay, well then how much nitrogen's in that? Oh, 60 pounds. Who told you that? The seed guy. Okay. Well, how much of that you going to get this year? I don't know. All of it? None of it? Depends on, that's just your own perception, right? So with the cover crop test, what we're actually doing is we're having you go out and sample a cover crop. And the way it works is that we're doing something where you can go out and sample a given area in your field. That could be a 3 foot by 3 foot square. It can be a 1 foot by 1 foot. You maybe do that 6 times throughout the field, to get a representative. It's like pulling a composite soil sample, right? Multiple cores go into the same bucket. But you shove all this material, you clip it off above ground, and you shove all this material into a trash bag. Maybe 2 if you're growing, monster cover crops. But you ship that off to the lab. Now, I know what you're thinking. You want me to ship a trash bag of material on the back of a UPS truck to the lab? And the answer is yes, because it's actually cheaper to ship that trash bag than it is a box of soil samples. Nice thing about shipping companies, they charge by weight. So when you send that in to us, what we're going to do is we're going to get a wet weight on that sample. We're going to dry it. We're going to determine moisture. Now that we know the wet weight and the moisture, we can calculate dry matter. This is nothing new. This is called a feed analysis, by the way. So now we have dry matter, but if you tell me the area that you sampled, we can extrapolate that dry matter into tons per acre of biomass. So now we know the first thing we really need to know. How much? Now we're just using the above ground. This is the conservancy that's built into this test. We're not going to extrapolate and assume 50% above, 50% below, or based on the species, this percent above, below. And by the way, it is a mix. If you're growing a mix, you do the exact same thing as a monoculture. So once we have this, we say, for example, you have 3 tons of dry matter per acre. And then we run total carbon and total nitrogen. Now you have a second component of understanding the decomposition. You have the seed-in ratio of that cover crop. The higher the carbon content, the slower it is to break down. all other factors being equal. Okay? So we know that piece of information, and then we run a plant tissue analysis on it. So if you've ever sent in corn leaves or anything and had a plant tissue analysis, you get percent nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sodium, zinc, iron, manganese, etc. Well, now if we know the percent nitrogen, and you've got 2 tons, and we'll just make the math easy, we'll say it's 10%, we can come back and say, okay, 10% nitrogen, 4,000 pounds to the acre, that's 400 pounds of nitrogen in the above ground biomass of that cover crop. We know the seed-in ratio. Hopefully we have a little idea about your climate, whether you're irrigated, non-irrigated, whether you're, what's your rainfall, what's your average temperature, that kind of thing. And then if we actually couple a Haney test with this, which we'll talk about, we have an idea of the microbial activity of that soil and the respiration. So yes, are we guessing? We are. But do we have more of an educated guess? I feel like we do. And we've had a lot of producers use this for additional credits. Now, it's not just nitrogen. We give you the same numbers for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, etc. And so you have a little bit of an idea of what's actually being tied up in that cover crop. Now, for all the nutrients except nitrogen, where did they come from? Well, they came from your soil, right? The cover crop is not accumulating or pulling zinc out of the air, right? So that's coming from your soil. But the nitrogen, depending on what you're growing, you can be adding nitrogen to that system. So if you've got legumes in that mix, there's a good chance you're fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere through the microbes. But for even growing cereal rye, you're tying up residual nitrate and ammonium in that system. And what you're doing is basically locking it up temporarily into that system. And you're going to hold it so we're not have a lower risk of leaching or devolatilization, that kind of thing. So this is how we're using this. Now, there's no numbers on this. This is just to show you an example of what that report looks like. So we have that wet weight, tear weight, all that dry matter area sampled, and then that's what all goes into those numbers down below. So you've got results on a dry basis. Those are similar to your plant tissue analysis that you would see. Those are in percents, parts per million, great. But then we convert everything over to a pounds per acre of nutrient based on that dry matter. And that's really where the value is with this. So moving out of the cover crop test, because this is a soil conference, right? I'm here to talk about soil testing. I want to point out the first thing you really need to do is establish your purpose. What is your goal? So, yeah, we can say grow more, right? Grow a higher yield. Okay. Increase organic matter. Okay. But I'm talking, what is your goal? Do you have a compaction issue? Do you have a weed pressure issue? And maybe all of the above? Which one do you want to target first? Establish what your purpose is. Because I often get asked, or I often get told, I'll get a soil sample in the mail and somebody will say, well, run whatever you think. I'm sorry. I have no idea what I think. I'm not on your farm. And we receive soil samples I've got soils in the lab from 17 different countries right now. I've been in the office 3 days since January 10th. I cannot travel to everybody's farm and tell you what I think. Tell me what you think. And I will help design a testing program with you to address your issues. Because if you throw the kitchen sink at this is what it looks like. A lot of people show this dendrogram and they talk about physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the soil, and where they overlap, you've got soil health. Well, this is what testing looks like when you add it in. You've got tests that are designed for physical attributes, some are chemical, some overlap between the two, etc. But if you wanted me to run this on a single sample and we were able to do all of these tests, you're going to get a bill for about $1,800. And then you're going to ask me what it means, and I'm going to say, I have no idea. Too much information, right? So have a goal in mind, and we'll help you cater your testing program around it. Really quick, here's just some real general how-tos, because I get asked this question all the time. When should I sample? How to do it, etc. So the general how-tos is we typically recommend a 0 to 6 or 0 to 8 inch depth. I don't like that depth. But the reason we do that is because most of the people pulling soil samples and have dealt with soil samples, this is the depth they used, and these are the depths that most universities say they, okay, here we go, I'm going to get in trouble, calibrated their soil test results to, were these depths. So we recommend this. Now, Nebraska's a 0 to 8 inch state, Iowa's a 0 to 6, you go to Kansas, it's 0 to 10. At the end of the day, if you're working with somebody or you're doing soil testing, stick with the depth you're running. That's the big thing. We also do this mostly on composites or zone sampling. So I don't really want you to send me 2.5 or 3 acre grids and ask me for $100 worth of tests, because economically it doesn't make sense for you. It only makes sense for me. And that doesn't do me any good. I want a client for as long as I can have a client. I don't want to put you out of business. So the goal here is to be able to focus in on zones, specific management areas, trouble spots, and I always say start with your absolute worst ground. You have the least to lose and the most to gain. Prove it there. If you can prove it there, you can prove it anywhere. So that's generally what I recommend. A lot of big things is on temperature. So this is a lot of what we run as a biological assay. You don't want to pull samples and throw them on the dash of your pickup truck in mid-August and leave them there for 2 weeks. Microbes are not happy. Also, do not throw them in the back of your pickup and spill gasoline and diesel all over them. You'd be surprised how many times that happens. And I will let you know, you know what, I'm going to say this. I'll pick on the universities here. This is how good the research is coming out of some university projects. We received 80 soil samples from a university that will remain nameless. They're a long way from here. And it was very apparent that these samples had soaked in gasoline for about 3 days. And he wants to run PLFA microbial analysis, and now PLFA works by looking at fats, oils. Does anybody know what's in gasoline? You have any idea where it comes from? I called him and I said, these samples are no good. I mean, we can run them, but the results are garbage. I might as well just throw a handful of darts at a board and give you some numbers. And he said, it's a grant project. I don't care, run them. Okie dokie. Cut me the check, we'll run them. I mean, what do you do, right? I mean, listen, you want to buy a hamburger at a store and toss it out your window. I don't think the hamburger chain cares what you do with it afterwards. So that's what we did. We ran them. But again, that's some of that's the data that's being collected. If you value, you're paying good money for these services, so make sure you do the sampling part right. Work with somebody who's willing to do it with you right. We generally say that a sample can represent up to 40 acres. Now, that's within zones. Now, you get out to Nebraska, we have cornfields that are a section, right? 640 acres, and they're as flat as this room. And there's one soil type. And it's all managed exactly the same way. We can extrapolate up a little bit from 40 acres. But when Russell talks to you, he'll talk about the fact that he's got 368 fields and about 200 total acres. Right, Russell? No, it's not quite that bad. But when you start chopping these things up, we've got to look at soil types, different zones. So this sample representation gets a little smaller at times. Year one establishes your baseline, and we'll talk more about that. And we can actually determine your potential from the baseline. So all those areas they told you to ignore when you sample, fence rows, tree lines, etc., well, that kind of goes out the window. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to go out and pull 30 samples from a fence row. No, you can pull one and just have a little bit of an idea of what your potential is. That kind of sets your bar. Now, in some cases, we can beat the bar. But there's no reason for somebody in New Mexico to try to shoot for the same soil health score results as somebody in central Illinois. Climate and environment, soil type just won't let that happen. So have an idea of what your potential is. Just like I know, no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to dunk a basketball. Unless we lower the hoop to 6 feet, 4.5 feet. Right? Know what your potential is. And it's okay to live within that potential. So one of the other tests we run for soil is what we call total nutrient digest. Now this one's a little different. So all soil tests, I don't care what your extract is. If you're using an extract test, Malic 3, Malic 1, Bray 2, Olson, H3A, water, modified Morgan, go on and on. Those extracts represent what is plant available, right? That they're all designed to show you something that is what they consider plant available. The difference is that if you run the exact same soil sample for all of those extracts, outside of nitrate, you get a different result. Phosphorus is the big one. You can run the same soil test for 7 different extracts, you get 7 different results. How frustrating is that? Have people call me all the time and I have to try to interpret all of that. That's the frustration with it. Now, the total nutrient digest is actually looking at your soil's net worth when it comes to nutrients. It works like a plant digest. We are going to digest the organic material, we're going to release all of the mineral component of your soil, and we're going to analyze for it. Because unfortunately, soil tests were originally designed to help you understand where you didn't need to apply nutrients or how much you needed to apply. And somehow they've kind of transitioned into a scare tactic to get you to buy fertilizer. I'm not against fertilizer, but what I'm saying is I hear so many people call me and say, my agronomist says I have no phosphorus in my soil. Well, why is that? Well, because my soil test was 15 parts per million. It's like 50 pounds to the acre. I've only got 50 pounds of phosphorus and I have to go buy 300 pounds of 1152. No. We run a total nutrient digest on this, and I'll guarantee you got over 600 pounds of phosphorus. I did this for a guy in Iowa who just swore up and down he had no potassium, no calcium. We ran this test, and I came back in 6 inches. He had 12,000 pounds of potassium. Now, his extract test told him he had like 135 parts per million, 250 pounds roughly, right? So when you do these extract tests, what you're looking at is again, going back to the money analogy, you're looking at what's available, what's in your checking account. This is telling you your net worth. Just because your soil's worth $10 million or just because your farm's worth $10 million doesn't mean you can write a $10 million check. And if you could, come see me after this event, we'll talk. So this is what the total nutrient digest report looks like. Again, don't worry about the numbers because they're all zeros. But we're going to measure carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, etc. And you're going to get these reported in percents and part per million. And we're going to do nutrients in pounds per acre. So we equated that. And then I've added a third column called fertilizer equivalent. All this is for is to show you that if you've got 3,000 pounds of phosphorus in your soil, was it Mark earlier, what's your farm average? 4.2% OM? 4%? Okay, CEC was 4.7. Okay, so for every 1% soil organic matter you have right at about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. Okay? So if you got 3% OM, you're at 3,000 pounds of nitrogen. How much urea do you have to buy to get 3,000 pounds of nitrogen? Right? 6,500 pounds? The point of that number, of that column, is to just show you the value of what you already have. When that guy looked and saw that he was going to have to buy 11,650 pounds of 1152 to get the same amount of phosphorus that he already had, he goes, well, no wonder the fertilizer dealer keeps telling me I don't have any. I said, right. Now, if you can farm to release some of that and manage to release some of that, you can fill the gap with fertilizer, but your gap gets smaller. Okay? That's the goal behind a lot of the message I'm delivering today. It's not about eliminating those inputs. It's about getting the best bang for your buck on those inputs. Any questions so far? I'm going to jump into this one. This one will be a lot more in-depth. No? Is everybody still awake? I'm glad Russell goes after lunch today. He's much more exciting than I am. Nobody likes this. So I always give Russell a hard time because Russell can put together an entire PowerPoint presentation and just show pictures. And I can't do that. Otherwise, I just show you pictures of this all day. Well, that's a Latchet 8500. Who cares? Sounds funny, like when Russell says, well, this is my planter, and it's a 782814X218. I have no idea what the hell he's talking about, right? But I'm going to have some data up here, and I'll try to make it as fun and interesting as I can. But I'm going to step through how the Haney test is different than most conventional tests. So when you run a conventional soil test, this is basically what you see. I've got NPK at the top. Now, it's not just NPK. It's just soil fertility. You've got soil pH, and then you've got organic matter, and we put all those things together, and we try to tell you what your recommendation is. And the recommendation is typically centered on plant nutrient demand, right? So it's based on the fertility that you have in your soil and the fertility demand of the crop, and the gap is what we end up recommending you put on. Now, some people can argue that organic matter is a biological approach. How many of you have asked this question? How much nitrogen can I take credit for my soil organic matter? Did anybody ask that question? Or do you have a lab telling you, well, for every 1%, we'll give you a credit for 30 pounds? Now, that's pretty common practice. Here's the issue with that. How many of you in this room, by show of hands, want to decrease your soil organic matter? Imagine that. I've only found 3 things that every farmer seems to agree on. Yields are not high enough. Couple that with really bad commodity price. No matter how high they are, they're never high enough. Number 2, the weather's never really good enough. And number 3, I don't want to lose soil organic matter. I was on a farm in North Carolina last week that we ran soil samples for, and the average OM on this field is 44%. Excuse me, not 4.4, 44%. And I asked this young farmer, I says, do you realize that you have enough nutrients tied up in your organic matter that you could farm this until you were dead and then come back resurrected as a farmer in 200 years and still farm it? And he goes, yeah. And I said, do you want to decrease organic matter? He says, hell no. I'm trying to increase it. Right? I've never heard anybody say they want to decrease it. But here's the problem. When you take nutrients out of the soil organic matter, guess what you do? Destroy soil organic matter. You cannot take eggs out of a cake and still have cake. Organic matter is a different animal. It contains carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, zinc, iron, manganese. And when you take any of those things out, you have to consume the carbon around it to release that. So we don't give a credit for organic matter. We're going to approach it a little differently. Yes, you are going to be breaking down organic matter. Much like you're going to spend money out of your checking account, you're going to put it back in your checking account, right? So you're going to be destroying organic matter at the same time as building organic matter. It is a continuum. It was no different than when I had to remodel my house. I was destroying a bathroom at the same time my wife was screaming at me to finish the kitchen. Guess what? Sawzall in one hand, drywall mud and pan in another, because that's what the microbes are doing. So how do we approach soil health? Well, first of all, we have to start looking at this more in nature's image. So I stole this slide from Rick Haney, and he always pointed out a lot of these things is that Mother Nature grows a skin for living systems. What do we call that in ag? You've all been fighting them for years. Weeds. That's Mother Nature's approach to grow a skin. Mother Nature does not like bare soil. Matter of fact, it doesn't like concrete. And that's why it'll break down and you have weeds growing up through the cracks in your foundations and in your driveways and in the streets. That's what Mother Nature does. Cycles nutrients. When's the last time you went out just out of the goodness of your heart and bought $150,000 worth of fertilizer to fertilize that prairie? Or the forest? Or hell, the ditch next to your farm? But yet they're not bare. They grow. Now, I know that farming systems are a little different. We're exporting nutrients. So again, I'm not telling you you shouldn't replace what you remove, but I'm just asking. Mother Nature does this for us. Cycles nutrients. They're diverse. There's no such thing as a monoculture in the real world. I will challenge you to find one. They don't exist. Yet in agriculture, here we are being told that we have to maintain a monoculture. And one of the biggest reasons we hear this is regarding competition. So let me ask you, how many of you grow corn? Nobody in the room grows corn. Great. Now what are we doing here, Russell? I'm from Nebraska.
There's a lot of corn growers here.
I know, all right, so let me ask you this. What is the number one largest competitor with a corn plant?
Grass. Wheat.
Wheat? Grass?
Other corn.
Corn. A corn plant competes with another corn plant more than any other species. Why? It's exactly the same root architecture. It is the same plant canopy architecture. It needs exactly the same things at the exact same time as every other corn plant. It competes harder than anything else. So when somebody tells you the idea of you can't do this or you can't add that because it creates more competition, it creates different competition. But what it also does is open the door for collaboration. Most plants collaborate. If they just competed and that's all they did, somebody would win and we would see nothing but monocultures all over this planet. But we don't. Mother Nature seeks balance. So do you know what the seed-in ratio of your soil organic matter is? This is a free one. I'm not even going to analyze it for you. It's 12-1. And I can make that same statement in Brazil. I can make that same statement in Alberta, Canada. It is 12-1. Mother Nature does that automatically. So the idea of always trying to chase nutrient balance ratios and putting things on, I'm not against some of that. There are certain times where we need to fix something that is completely out of whack. But I will tell you that you will not fix it and have it stay static. It will not sit like that. When you test it again next year, it will be, quote unquote, out of whack, out of balance, and you'll have to rebalance it and continue on and on and on. We could actually do this every 2 weeks, and you'll have to continue to balance it every 2 weeks. Mother Nature changes this for us. Highly integrated and has millions of years of R&D experience. Now, I know everybody's got a different idea of the earth and all those things, but I'm going to tell you right now, the technology that we have and all the management tools that we have, I don't care if the earth was 40,000 years old, 2,000 years old, relative to what we do as producers and how long we've been doing it, Mother Nature's been doing this a long time. We just try to use technology to kind of drive a square peg into a round hole. And Mother Nature builds plant root networks. This has to do with that competition part. We've known this for years. Plants communicate back and forth. They communicate through the microbes. Certain plants are very good at transitioning nutrients and water to other plants. We know this. It is a community aspect. Now, I'll pick on Grand Rapids because we're at least an hour away and I don't want to get sued. So, what would Grand Rapids be like if every single person who lived there was a lawyer? A mess. That's a nice way of saying it. Would it be a good community to live in? Would it function well? No. Everybody's exactly the same. Yeah, we wouldn't call it Grand Rapids anymore either. We'd give it a nice new name. But the point is that the reason why this collaboration works is because anytime you have a community, it requires different skill sets, different bases of knowledge, different abilities to make a healthy community function. You need doctors and police and dentists and people willing to pick up and take care of trash and people who want to cook and provide. You need all of those things. It's what makes a community healthy. It's the same thing in the soil. We need diversity of microbes driven through diversity of plants because this is how the system works. So how do we measure any of this? That's all fun and feel good, but I'll tell you right now, if you go out to your soil, get on your hands and knees and start trying to count microbes and identify the species, you're going to be really, really busy and tired and mad. Don't do that. So we have to have different ways to do this. Now, we're not going to throw out soil fertility. It's important. We still have to measure NPK, etc. But we're also going to start looking at organic nitrogen and organic phosphorus. Now, when I use the term organic up here today, I do not want you to synonymize that with organic farming. Okay, I'm not talking about organic farming. I'm talking about nitrogen and phosphorus that's not in the traditional nitrate and ammonium form or the phosphate. It's pools of nutrients in your soil that are available to microbes. And we'll talk about that in more detail. We're going to look at microbial biomass. These are the workers. These are the people, the organisms that are in your soil doing this work. We're going to look at water extractable carbon. This is a subset of organic matter. We'll tie that in, and we're going to look at a carbon and nitrogen balance between this. So we're really evaluating the community the microbes live in. I'm going to start with the NPK side of it. This is the shortest and, in my opinion, least important part of this. So, for NPK, I mentioned the extracts earlier, right? Malic 3, Bray 1, Bray 2, etc., etc. So, Rick Haney kind of had this idea. He said, why are we using chemistry in the lab that your soil is never exposed to in real life? Trust me, if it rained Malic 3, we wouldn't be here today. We would have all starved years ago. It is very acidic. It's a strong acid, highly buffered, made up mostly of ammonium nitrate and nitric acid. You don't really want to get it on your skin, but this is one of the extracts that's used. So the idea here is to use a soil extractant that mimics soil solution, and the organic acids that are produced by living plants. So this is what we call root exudates, right? Now, to all the crop farmers in this room, how mad would you be when I tell you that up to 50% of all the carbon captured by your corn crop is lost to the soil through the roots as exudates? I said that in Iowa, and the guy says, you're telling me my 300 bushel corn crop should have been 600 bushel? I said, yep, in theory. Why doesn't that do? Or why doesn't that work? Plants are just leaky? They're inefficient? Oh, they're doing it for a purpose. They have an abundance of carbon that they have access to. They have the ability to do something most organisms on this planet do not. Capture sunlight, photosynthesize. They're willing to give up massive amounts of carbon to the soil because that's what feeds the microbes. And the microbes are the ones that control nutrient mobility and cycling. They are the ones responsible. They're the gatekeepers. So you see me stand up here in this black hat, and we got a little joke. I'm not a farmer, or I'm not a cowboy either. I ride an ATV sometimes. But we've got this little joke with a bunch of us that travel around and do this. We got this little thing called the Black Hat Mafia. It's a real thing. You can look it up. The godfather of the Mafia is Mr. Jimmy Emmons, and he is referred to as Mr. Jimmy Emmons. Nah, he'd laugh if he heard me say that. But I always joked around because I said, the microbes in the soil are essentially the mafia of the soil. They want a payment. Their payment is carbon. And if you don't pay them, they tie up nutrients. It is a trade system that takes place. So we're trying to mimic that process to evaluate what is actually extractable and available to your plant. And we do that, and we're actually looking at all of these things: nitrate, ammonium, phosphate, potassium, etc. And these three acids that are down here at the bottom, those are the three acids that are going into that. Now, there's hundreds of compounds that plants exude, but these are three of the most common. And then the two things that are a little different is we've got total phosphorus and organic phosphorus. Now, that total phosphorus is total extractable. All that means is that it's all the phosphorus that's soluble in this solution, but it's not yet plant available. Plant available is phosphate. But if it's soluble in solution, Guess who can access it? Microbes. And they're going to convert it at some point. We call that phosphorus mineralization. And that is not a term I coined. So anybody who talks about phosphorus mineralization, how frustrated are you when you have to put on 18 pounds of P2O5 to get 1 pound of phosphorus back out of your soil? Most of that is being tied up in the biology and in the geology, the CEC, and all of the mineral, I mean, it's not CEC directly, but all the mineralogy in your soil. The microbes are the ones that actually mobilize it. Has anybody been to Colorado? Has anybody been anywhere where they have rock? Let me ask that question. You ever driven through the mountains and you see a tree growing out of the side of a rock? And you think, who the hell climbed up there and planted that tree? How's that possible? The plant, there's no carbon. Half the time there's not even soil there. The plant starts by pumping carbon down into the surface through the roots. The microbes, especially mycorrhizal fungi, in this case, they produce enzymes to dissolve rock. The dissolved rock is what's feeding the plant nutrients. No microbes, no tree. No tree, no microbes in that scenario, right? But we've seen this in real life. This happens even in our soils every day. That's it on nutrients. Now I'm going to get into the good stuff. Microbial biomass. How do we measure microbial biomass? Now, the way we're doing this is through respiration. Now, when we first started running this, we used a technology called Solvita. And I'm not here to bash on Solvita, but it didn't work very well. It was a gel paddle, and it turned color based on the amount of CO2 your soil produced. It almost worked like a pH dip strip in a swimming pool. It gives you an idea, but it's not really a measurement. So we went back to one of the technologies that was used to help develop Solvita, which is NDIR, or infrared analysis. And we are going to still follow the same process. We dry the soil, we re-wet it in a sealed jar, incubate it at a set temperature for 24 hours, and the amount of carbon dioxide your soil can produce is relative to the amount of microbes it contains. If you really think about that, we're optimizing moisture, optimizing temperature, setting the time, and we're causing the microbes this huge flush of activity. And we're using that CO2 as an indicator of microbial biomass. Okay, because microbes are like we are. We consume carbon, we breathe in oxygen, and we exhale CO2. And if you're not photosynthesizing, that is the process most organisms follow. Now, the neat thing is that microbes most of the time are dormant. They're not doing a whole lot. They wait till conditions are right, and that's usually following a significant drying and re-wetting event. Now, I know, everybody says it's either never dry here or it's never wet here and there's never anything in between. I get it. Go to the Dakotas, they're going to tell you it's dry, right? But on average, 4 times a year, you have this giant flush of activity. Most of the activity, most of the nutrient cycling happens following this. In between those times, what we're looking at is what they call basal metabolic rate. In other words, you're sitting here at this table, maybe sleeping, that is your basal metabolic rate. The Michigan Sasquatch comes out of the woods and starts chasing you and you're running and screaming, that is your potential of activity. All right? Russell, do not volunteer to chase. So just from this one number, there's a lot of things up here. We're not going to go through this. I'm just showing you that from one number, this is the type of information you can get. One number, and there are about 56 numbers on the Haney Test. This is one of them. Now, don't let that overwhelm you, because when you understand what microbes are doing in the soil from a large view, we don't have to know what every species does and when they do it and exactly the enzymes they use and all that. But if you understand that microbes are driving nutrient cycling, residue decomposition, etc., this represents that potential. And from a management perspective, you can actually influence this number and use it in your favor. So, earlier I asked if anybody was growing cover crops. Has anybody had any trouble with residue management? A lot of people will say to me, I have a residue problem. I said, no, you do not. You have a biology problem. And what really gets them is when I say, you have residue that you can't get to disappear, you know what your answer is? More residue, just a different kind. Yes, you can bale it, you can haul it, you can till it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever do those things. Listen, you're ready to plant, you're in a crunch. I mean, what are you going to do? But what I'm saying is that's treating the symptom. The disease is that you have a biology problem, and you're going to have to add more residue to the system to get that to work. Now, with that being said, I know Gabe was here a couple years ago, and I'm good friends with Gabe. And I know Gabe likes to show pictures of cover crops that are 8 feet tall. And a lot of people will walk away from that and think that if I grow anything less than 8 feet tall, I'm not successful. I'm not doing the right thing. No, I'm going to tell you, Gabe has a very large biological furnace. In other words, that man has 100 million kids to feed. It requires a lot of food to feed all of that. So he needs to grow things this tall. A 4-inch tall annual ryegrass plant will put roots 4 feet down. I don't care how deep those roots are. If you are a bacteria, 1 inch of roots is like here to the moon. It is not a failure to grow cover crops 3 inches tall. As a matter of fact, it might be a failure if you don't let them grow, if they do grow taller than 3 inches in certain situations. Now, as your biological demand gets higher, so should your food source, right? It's about balancing that out. And so that's the type of information you can get from just this number. Now I want to just show you, this is what summer respiration, or soil respiration looks like on an annual basis. Now I just took when I say fallow, I'm talking an annual, summer annual with no cover crop. And this is kind of the pattern we see. Now this is the same pattern we see whether it's North Carolina or here, or North Dakota. The only difference is maybe a little shift in the timing. So this is running from January 1st to December 31st. You can see this big uptick in respiration and then a crash. Well, as the microbes start to increase respiration, they start to burn up resources. And if you were in a fallowed system, you're not replacing those resources. And then we see this other uptick, right? Well, that's usually when your crop is hitting that vegetative growth stage. You know, in corn, I mean, I'm talking like V3, V4, and that's where it starts to pick back up because that's root exudates being pumped back into the system, feeding the crop. We have a kind of a plateau or a balance stage. That's dependent on environment and how many plants you have and how healthy they are, how much root exudates they're able to put out. And then you have this other little bump at the end. That's your root sloughing and harvest. That's maturity. And then slowly it goes down as soil temperatures cool and resources get used. Interestingly, this is with a cover crop. They look almost identical. But when you put them together, this is what we typically see. So you've got overall higher respiration where you have more food going into the system. Makes sense, right? You also have a little bit of what we call biological priming effect. So earlier in the year, you see an uptick of pickup, and we don't see near the dip between spring and when you've got that summer annual growing. So just to kind of show you, because often I get asked, well, when should I sample or what should I expect? And this is typically what we see. So I'm going to lump these two together. This is the organic N and P and then the organic carbon on the water extract. So if you Google the nitrogen cycle, you're going to find 100 of these different types of images. This is just one of them. I will tell you that most soil test laboratories focus on nitrate. One compound to give you nitrogen credit, and there are hundreds of compounds in the soil that contain nitrogen. If you get east of the Mississippi, most of the soil tests are pH/pK. They don't even measure nitrate. They just say, if you had any left, you don't have it anymore. It's gone. And I'll tell you the danger in that. This is just one example. We ran 13 samples for a gentleman in North Florida. He was going to grow corn, 200 bushel goal. The university told him 220 units of nitrogen, done. He said, I want you to run the Haney test, but don't even worry about running nitrogen because we already know what we're going to do. And I said, well, you can't get the Haney test without nitrogen. So we ran it. Across those samples, the average residual nitrogen in his soil was 460 pounds to the acre. And the University of Florida said, no, it's not there, put on 220 units. Wouldn't you like to save that money? I bet he wished he would have saved that money a year ago. My point is that if you don't measure it, you don't know. And they dropped nitrogen from soil tests telling you that you were going to lose all of it east of the Mississippi because it's too wet, because it's a lot easier to sell you fertilizer for nitrogen if you don't know how much you already have there. Pretty simple. This test is going to include that nitrate, and we're going to look at organic nitrogen as well. Before I jump into that, a little word on carbon, because now we're going to talk about carbon, because these two things are tied together. So total carbon includes organic and inorganic. In other words, organic matter and calcium carbonate. Now, depending on where you're at in the country, calcium carbonate may not matter. What are the pHs? I'm sure they just range all over the place up here, but what are the pHs of some of your soils? Do they 6.5, 6.8? They get all the way up to 8 in spots? So where you've got pHs of 8, you've got excess lime in those soils. You've got inorganic carbon as calcium carbonate. Where you have a pH of 6.5, you do not. And so your total carbon in those cases is the same as organic. They're used synonymously or interchangeably. And then you have active and labile. Labile is just a fancy term for active carbon. Active, meaning dynamic, meaning it's accessible, it's cycling readily in the system. This is what the microbes are eating. This is what's leaving your soil as carbon dioxide. This is the photosynthesis. These are the root exudates. That's your active carbon. And then you have the soil organic matter versus carbon. I mentioned earlier soil organic matter, 1% soil organic matter has 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. 1% soil organic matter also has around 12,000 pounds of carbon. So you have a pretty good idea of carbon just by knowing the organic matter. Anybody in here working on carbon markets, participating in carbon markets? You know, I ask that question in every one of these and I never get anybody to raise their hand. That's okay. I don't do anything with carbon markets other than run their soil test. And I will say this, not all carbon markets are created equal. Most of them are using a linear approach where it's just based on capture. And that's not the way it needs to work. I'm not going to spend any time on that because nobody's running them, but this is what I'm talking about. If you Google carbon and look at a picture, I pulled this straight off Google. I didn't put this together. But you'll see it's a linear thing. All it says is rangelands are losing carbon and all of the carbon is leaving the soil. Now this person must have been selling compost because on the next picture it says the benefits of compost. Look at that, a complete 180 and everything's going directly back into the soil. There you go. You want to participate in the carbon market? Put on compost, collect your check. Done, right? It's not that simple, obviously. So then you can find these types of pictures. Now I like this one because it looks like my 5-year-old daughter drew it. And I'll tell you, most 5-year-old kids probably understand this better than most people that are walking around with a PhD in carbon. Unfortunately. I've had this discussion with my daughter. My daughter's like, but Daddy, what about the oceans? I'm like, whoa. Yeah, let's talk about that. Kids are smart. Not just mine. I mean, mine is smart, but, right? But I like this. It's better, but there's still one big piece missing, and it's this piece. So I'm going to spend just a second on this. So if we start clear at the top, I don't know if this has nope, doesn't have a pointer on it. Maybe it does. Oh, it does. Okay, if we start at the top for CO2, CO2 is coming into the plant. We have different compound pools coming from the plant. Complex compounds. This is stuff that you see. Leaf litter, roots, stover. This is cellulose, hemicellulose, all those fun compounds, lignin. But then We have all the simple compounds. These are your root exudates. These are simple sugars, simple organic acids, etc. The interesting thing is that all of these feed into a microbial factory. Bacteria take advantage of simple compounds. Fungi take advantage of complex compounds. The complex compounds are broken down into simple compounds. It is a chain. But what's interesting is through this process, most of the carbon is driven back out as CO2. Because that is the cost of doing business. Right? It takes money to make money. Well, it takes carbon to store carbon. But what happens down here is this is what they call the entombing effect. This is your stable carbon pool. So throughout this process, little bits and pieces are being driven off and shoved into that pool. That's your savings account. And it's mostly made up of extracellular metabolites, in other words, decomposition waste, and microbial necromass, dead microbes. So when somebody argues to me that why do we want a large microbial community because all they're doing is blowing CO2 off the soil, that statement is true if you don't feed them. If you don't feed them, they eat organic matter. They eat from this stable pool. But if you want to build organic matter, you need a lot of workers because most of that organic matter is made up of dead microbes. So how does somebody like Russell, and you'll see this, how does somebody like Russell have respiration numbers on his farm off the charts? 600, 700 ppm where the average is like 80. Yet his organic matter keeps going up. It's because of this process. The entombing effect is happening. Yes, he's driving a lot of CO2. If I made $1 million a month, I could spend $950,000 a month and still save more money a month than I earn now. Interesting. So it's related to carbon income more so than it is related to the microbes. But you need both. So a quick word on organic matter and organic carbon. Man, this is going to be hard. Okay, here we go. Soil organic matter is basically the house. More organic matter, the bigger the house. The bigger the house, the more microbes you can hold. However, water-soluble carbon is the food that's driving the microbes within that house. Anybody here have kids? Nobody's reproduced in this. Okay, great. Just Russell and I guess. All right. Feel sorry for the world. Look, if you've got kids, my 5-year-old daughter eats more than I do. What happens if you don't stock the fridge, stock the pantry, right? They get mad and they tear the house down. Microbes do the same thing. Now, if you want a better analogy, how many of you have livestock? Anybody? Okay, thank you. Participation. What happens if you build a fence around your pasture the size of that one on Jurassic Park? And then you turn in them cattle and you say, see you later. They're going to eat the good stuff first, but guess what? You're going to go to jail for animal cruelty because they're going to be stripping bark off of trees and they're going to be eating fence posts. And I've actually, unfortunately, seen this. A gentleman got arrested not too far from where I live for doing this. Okay? The point is that they will destroy their own habitat in order to survive. That is what we see with soil compaction. It's not the livestock, it's not the tractors. Those things add to it. Tillage adds to it. Microbes are starving and they consume their own habitat. The carbon that holds the soil system together gets consumed out of necessity. You add water to it and a little bit of pressure, and guess what? You just made a brick. Which is exactly how they make bricks. And pave roads, by the way. You ever see them knife in anhydrous down a road and then disc it 100 times, add some water to it? They're building a road bed. Just think about that. So if we look at water-soluble carbon, this is what we see. You notice it kind of follows respiration with a cover crop. You put them together and this is what you get. Now it makes sense that these follow respiration. Respiration is microbes consuming carbon. If I start spending money, my checking account balance goes down. Right? That's how this works. So oftentimes people will say to me, well, I noticed that this number went up and the other one went down. This can't be good. How do we interpret this? Well, we take it as a system. It's not just a number. Understand what's happening in the system. Now, we call this spending rate versus income microbially active carbon. Ideally, we want this number to be between 50 and 80%. If the microbes are consuming carbon faster than we supply it, our MAC number is above 80%. Yes, it can be above 100. That tells me that the microbes are eating organic matter. If it's below 50%, especially below 30%, it tells me that food is not the problem. It's something else. And it can be pH, it can be soluble salts, it can be a number of things. By the way, if anybody has a question on soluble salts, come find me later, because I got a whole lot of really fun things to say about that. But we're not going to right now. So where these two match or line up is where we have percent MAC. And in this scenario, we have a percent MAC around May that is greater than 100%. During that time, those microbes are eating organic matter. Okay? Now, this is just one example. Depending on the situation, this can happen for months on months or various times throughout the year. Yeah, I know what time it is, Russell. Give me 2 seconds.
My wheelhouse getting low.
Your wee ox getting low to eat a little food? So the interesting thing about this, and this is how we release nutrients, is C to N ratio on this extract. So for all of you that have kids, you ever had to watch your kids by yourself? First time I had to do that, I got that phone call, says you give kids breakfast this morning? I said, sure did. We had Coca-Cola and Pixie Sticks. They loved it. Bounce around the house like crazy, right? It says, well, you can't do that. It's all empty calories. It's just energy. There's no nutrition in that. And I said, oh, day's not over. So for supper, we had 2 Flintstone vitamins. We called it a day. Now, don't show this video to the, child services, because I didn't really do that. But the point is that you got to balance things out. Same thing with livestock. Energy versus nutrition. We're looking at balance of energy versus protein from a microbial standpoint. If you don't feed them the right balance, they tie up nitrogen. If the ratio is greater than 20 to 1, they'll tie it up for a while. We know this to be true. We see it happen all the time. On the other end, if you don't have enough energy in the system, you can have all the organic protein out there you want, and they can't convert it over to your crop because it requires energy. So you got to have that balance. This is just showing you kind of the ramifications of that. And I'm probably going to have to stop here, which I should have just skipped all the way to here, because this is the nitrogen comparison. I'll go through it really, really fast. This is when we're making nitrogen recs. So a lot of people say, what's the value in this test? This is corn at 200 bushels. We are doing 1.1 pounds per bushel. That's 220 pounds of N required. Below that is a list of your credits from a conventional soil test versus the Haney test. The only difference is we're giving you credit for ammonium and we're giving you credit for organic nitrogen release from the microbes. That's it. And I put 20 pounds in here because I've analyzed over 100,000 of these, and that's the average, about 20 pounds. Just based on that, your recommendation difference is about 30 pounds to the acre. Now you put dollars and cents to this. We say a Haney test is $50 a sample, represent up to 40 acres. That's a $1.25 cost. Average in savings, I use 20 instead of 30. That's an ROI of $18.75 an acre just if you choose to reduce that in by 20 pounds to the acre. That's at $1 a pound. Now Russell informed me I think it's like $1.40 the other day when he was looking at it at home. So this isn't about eliminating, it's about saving you money. And then this is the regen farm checks, my last slide. So something we've developed, this is a question I get all the time, is how do I know if I'm making progress? How do we define a regenerative farm? Okay? Well, with organic production, I'm not picking on any organic producers in here, I'm picking on the organic process. What they like to do is tell you what you can't do. If you don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and you do it for 3 years, we'll give you a certification. Great, neat. With this process, we're letting the soil data tell us, are you improving? So we use a 0 to 6 inch sample and a 6 to 12. The 6 to 12 serves as your inherent soil properties. It is based on climate, soil type, conditions, etc. The 0 to 6 serves as your management zone. How you choose to farm it is up to you. But if your 0 to 6 is improving, your soil by definition is regenerative. How you get there is up to you. Now we're using this process to basically certify your practices, and then that feeds into a regen verification, which Russell will probably talk about. But the important thing is the data still flow backwards to you. It flows to your land managers, your farms, etc. You get the opportunity to work with consultants, work with people to make adjustments to your farm. You also get to track progress, and it is completely independent of your neighbor. So don't give me the argument it'll work there, but it won't work here. When we designed these algorithms, we took all of that out of the equation. Real quick example, everybody knows Gabe. Gabe Brown's 0 to 6 on this field scored a 26 for a soil health score. His 6 to 12 scored a 13. Pretty darn good stuff. We plugged all the individual metrics into the soil algorithm we generated. It was regenerative. Surprise, surprise. But we took an organic pecan farmer in New Mexico. His 0 to 6 scored a 6.5. His subsoil scored a 1.5. We plug all the individual metrics into this algorithm. Guess what? Also regenerative. It has nothing to do with what Gabe's doing beyond the principles. It has nothing to do with Russell and his farm, and Russell's going to share you a really nice one that he was working on. But that's the way this is designed to work. And we represent up to 100 acres on this instead of 40. Now, again, it's still based on cropping zones and management zones, but the goal here is not to tell you to run double the number of samples. That's not the goal. So we extrapolated this out and we built the algorithm that way. But this is something really neat because food companies are calling me left and right, asking me where they're pledging all this money. They keep saying they're going to do all this. I just got an email this morning that Bank of America is looking at $1 trillion for lending for regenerative farmers. We've been working with them. The problem is they say we want to do this, and I'm saying Danone, Starbucks, these are huge companies, and they say we want to source this. How do we identify regenerative dairies? How do we find regenerative grain farmers? How do we find regenerative beef producers? And we thought it needed to be a data outcomes approach. So this is our approach to it and what we're doing. It's not perfect, but we're just getting started. So thank you. I know it's lunchtime. Appreciate it.
Lance is here all day, and we don't have much time for questions.
No, it's fine.
But you hit him up, save them, write them down.
There's my contact
Ask
info,
them
too.
later. And just a quick note about lunch. Back these doors, Aaron. So you guys can exit these doors and go around the side to the back. And we'll have one more session, and then you guys can receive some RUP credits, and then we'll talk about more like a discussion with the three guys with the tar spot update. So thank you and enjoy lunch.
And during that tar spot update, you have an hour in there we can all